In the history of Christian philosophy, it's hard to imagine a figure more towering than Saint Augustine. The 4th century bishop of Carthage left an enduring impact on almost every branch of Christian thought for centuries, including the arguments for the existence of God. In this video, I'm going to summarize Augustine's most distinctive argument for God, the argument from abstract objects. Now, I want you to imagine you're outside. Look around you. Unless you live in the dead center of a city or in a desert, you probably have trees nearby. You can probably even see multiple trees at the same time. But let me ask you something. How do you know that all these trees you're seeing are the same kind of thing? Tree. Well, you tell me you see these trees in front of you, and you notice they have certain features in common. They're tall. They have leaves on them. They have trunks. And because there's certain things they have in common, you give them the same name, tree. But if you said that, I might respond to you by pointing out that these trees have a lot of differences too. Some are taller than others. Some have wider trunks. Some are different types of trees entirely. Birch, oak, sycamore, palm, pine, maple. And if they have all these differences, how can they be the same kind of thing? It seems that what you have to do in order to justify calling all trees tree is abstract the things trees have in common with each other from the particular trees you see around you. In other words, you have to think about what's common to all trees instead of what might be different from tree to tree to tree. Every tree must have a trunk. That's common to all trees. Not every tree must be 17 feet 3 inches tall. That's particular to only some trees. Only by considering what trees have in common with other trees without considering what makes them distinct are you able to talk about trees with any kind of meaning. And what you're doing when you're taking what's common to all trees without thinking about what's particular to trees is arriving at what philosophers call a universal, or a pattern common to all instances of some kind of thing. Universals are examples of what philosophers call abstract objects. They're things that exist but that we can't interact with physically. We know that universals must exist at least as objects of thought, since we talk about them all the time. And we also know that they can't be physical, since the whole point of a universal is that it's divorced from the particular material instance of what it's universalizing. There's other examples of abstract objects I could bring up here too, like possible worlds, numbers, propositions, but I'm just going to keep it to universals for now. You see, if universals exist, the next question is to ask, where exactly do they exist? And there's a couple different ways we could go about answering this question. First, we could say that universals exist only in the material world. Under this view, whatever's common to all trees would exist only in individual trees. And there's certainly something to this idea, because universals are certainly found in particular things. After all, if the universal tree wasn't in a particular tree, we couldn't call it a tree. But the problem here is where this view says that universals exist only in particular things. For one thing, it seems like no universal really exists in any particular thing fully. Any particular things will have features in it that aren't part of the universal tree, and be lacking other features that are part of the universal tree. But perhaps more importantly, it seems like saying universals exist only in the material world makes universals dependent on the material world. But universals can't be dependent on the material world. I think most of us would say that what it is to be a tree would remain the same even if every tree went out of existence. This seems to show that universals must exist not just in particular material things, since they can exist without those particular material things. So this leads us to the second possible way of answering this question. We could suggest that universals exist both in the material world and in our minds. This is probably the view most famously associated with Aristotle. The idea here is that our minds take or abstract universals from the particular material objects we see around us. I see a couple trees over there in the distance, and my mind abstracts what's common to them and creates this mental idea of the universal tree. Now, this view is certainly a move in the right direction, but I don't think it can fully explain the existence of universals either. Here's the big problem. It seems that universals are necessary. They can't fail to exist. But our minds aren't necessary. At one point, each of our minds didn't exist. And at some point in the future, our minds aren't going to exist again. But it seems like universals would still exist even if there weren't any human minds to think about them. It would still be the case that a tree is a tree even if none of us were thinking about trees, or there were no human beings to think about trees. To take a bit of a different angle on it, think about the dodo bird. For millennia, the dodos existed without us knowing about them. And are we to say that during this time, the universal dodo bird was found only in the birds themselves? That would lead to the same paradoxes with the universal existing only in particular things I talked about earlier. So while universals do seem to exist in the mind and in particular material things, these can't be the only places they exist. This brings us to our third option, saying that universals exist in the material world, in our minds, and in something else. The question we have now is what this something else could be. And there's two basic options: in something that is a mind, or in something that is not a mind. The first option would mean that these universals exist in something like Plato's world of forms, universals existing entirely on their own, separate from both mind and matter in a kind of third realm of universals. Now, personally, I love Plato, and I think he might have done more for the history of philosophy than any other thinker. But there's a couple big problems with his world of forms theory. To take the biggest one, if these universals, or forms as Plato calls them, don't exist in either the material world or the mind, or a mind, how can they do anything? We know how universals can do things in the material world by being in a particular material thing and having that particular material thing do something. We know how universals can do things in a mind by being an idea in that mind uses to act on. But if some universals exist outside of both mind and matter, it seems that these universals would have to be causally inert, unable to do anything. And if universals don't do anything, then they could have no impact on our world. And if that's the case, how could we even know about them? Since the only way we know about something is by the impact it has on our world. So it seems that if universals exist apart from the material world and human minds, they must exist in a different kind of mind. So what can we say about what this mind or minds would look like? First, we would have to say that it's a fundamentally different kind of mind than our minds. In particular, it would have to be necessary or unable to fail to exist. After all, if it could fail to exist, we would run into the same problem we ran into earlier with the dodo birds. Namely, the one that says that if this mind could stop existing, it would seem that what it is to be a dodo bird would also stop existing, and that's absurd. But the only way that something could be absolutely necessary is if it is pure actuality. Pure actuality is Aristotle's term for something that doesn't lack anything at all, that has all perfections that could possibly be perfect in it perfectly. The reason a necessary mind must be like this is that if it lacked anything, it would be dependent on not gaining the things it lacked in order for it to continue being the kind of thing it is. And the whole point of a necessary mind is that it can't be dependent upon anything else for it continuing to be the kind of thing it is. But something that's pure actuality, that doesn't lack anything, would be infinite. Because if it was finite, then there would be a limit to it. There would be stuff that it lacked. Also, it would have to be unable to change, since to change, you have to gain something that you lack. This also means that this thing would have to be outside of time, since time measures change. And it would also have to be outside of the material world, since matter is necessarily changing. So this thing must be timeless and immaterial. And since it has all perfections perfectly, it must have all good qualities in its fullness. This would include qualities like goodness, power, and knowledge. So this thing would have to be all good, all knowing, and all powerful. And perhaps most importantly, there could only be one of these things, since the only way to differentiate two things is by pointing to some property that one thing has that the other thing doesn't have. The reason, for example, that two trees aren't the same tree is that one of them has some part or some quality in it that's different from other trees. It's either in a different place, or it's got a couple extra limbs, or it's a different kind of tree, or something like that. There has to be something different between two things for them to be different things. And if the necessary mind holding all universals in it doesn't lack anything, there's no way that we could say it's different from another thing of the same kind. So there could only be one necessary mind. So this necessary mind must be infinite, changeless, timeless, immaterial, all good, all-knowing, all-powerful, and singular. But when Catholics like Augustine talk about God, they're talking about a being that's infinite, changeless, timeless, immaterial, all good, all-knowing, all-powerful, and singular. So this argument serves as a philosophical demonstration of the existence of God. Thank you for watching this video. I would appreciate it if you could subscribe and like the video and do all that stuff. It really helps me. And God bless. Thank you.